Hello, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session on subjective experiences of war, one in which we're featuring at least two papers, I believe, on Ernst Jünger. And for those of you who are not aware of this, Telos has recently published one of his books, had it translated, and I'm going to give it a plug here for those who aren't aware of it. Ernst Jünger's Approaches, Drugs in Altered States. I highly recommend it. And, you know, you can also read it with some acid if you want to. You should. It's not bad. A bad experience. And for that reason, I'm wearing my best Grateful Dead t-shirt. And so on that point, we're now going to our speakers here, and we're going to pretty much stick to the same routine we've done up to this point, which everyone gets to speak for 15 minutes, and then I get to zap them. And we'll probably take a couple of questions before that. But I think first on the bill, we have Beau Mullen reading a paper on rogues, partisans, insurgents, examining Jünger's forced passage through Schiller's The Robbers and Kleist's Michael Kolhaas. Hope I read that properly, but anyway, you're on. Take it away.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right, good. This paper probably is a piece of probably what may end up being a larger work. So if it seems a mile wide and an inch deep, please accept my apology that maybe there's more coming. But the paper attempts to examine Ernst Jünger's The Forced Passage and its relevance to contemporary conflict by first discussing the figure of the forced rebel in The Robbers and Michael Kolhaas, The Robbers being by Schiller and Michael Kolhaas by Kleist. I argue that the protagonists of both works could be viewed as archetypes of Jünger's forced rebel, not simply because they take refuge from the state they resist in the wilderness, but also because they do so out of a radical sense of freedom and fanatical integrity. I also argue that the fate of both protagonists, both end up committing atrocities and resign themselves to execution, illustrates the danger inherent in this type of rebellion, particularly when taken to its extreme as it is in both works. Additionally, the forced rebel will be analyzed in terms of the modern surveillance and counterinsurgent state as described by Bernard Harcourt. Ernst Jünger's Forced Passage describes resistance on the part of the individual from modern governance, be it authoritarian tyranny or bureaucratic tyranny. It is a radical text, denounces much of life in modern society, and espouses a rejection of such life in favor of one lived in accordance with one's own conscience and in resistance to state oppression. Jünger views the individual as dominated by the forces of rationality, bureaucracy, technology, automatism in the modern world. His prescription for this life, which, keep in mind, is not necessarily meant to be its antidote, is the life of the forced rebel, one who rejects such domination, seeks a way to live inside it, and endeavors to work against it. When engaged in, say, kinetic resistance, the forest is much less of a metaphor, as the insurgent or the partisan must also often take refuge in the wilderness. Here, Jünger ascribes to the forest rebel characteristics we commonly associate with those participating in asymmetrical warfare. He writes, in regard to the forest rebel facing a foreign invasion, quote, "The forest rebel has no access to powerful means of combat, but he knows how a daring strike can destroy weapons that cost millions. He also has greater liberty than troops to choose his arena, and he will make his moves wherever destruction can be effected with minor effort," end quote. Here, Jünger is describing what we typically refer to as guerrilla or partisan warfare. Absent a foreign invasion, a radical form of the forest rebel can be seen in two iconic rebels of German literature, Michael Kolhaas from Henrik von Kleist's novella of the same name, and Karl Mohr, the protagonist of The Robbers by Friedrich Schiller. Both are in open conflict with the state, both are unable to exist under the conditions they find themselves living, and both are motivated by adherence to radical abstract conceptions of rights, equity, and freedom, respectively. And both take refuge outside the city. In this case, I guess the forced passage is literal. They both also illustrate the perils of such resistance, as both Kolhaas and Mohr commit atrocities and find themselves permanently outside the law and unable to effect change or even rejoin society, even if they so desired. Further, their actions in rebellion seal their fates, and both must resign themselves to execution. Although Kolhaas initially pursues justice through legal means by filing suit and resorts to violence only when his lawful actions are thwarted through manipulation of the system by those more powerful than he, it is important to note that his sense of justice is not dependent on the written law. Kolhaas's actions are not simply that of a wronged man frustrated by the inadequacies and corruptions of the legal system of his state, but more broadly, he is railing against the oppression of his property rights, dignity, and freedom. Kolhaas abandons the rational pursuit of justice through law and replaces it with an irrational pursuit of justice as a guerrilla fighter. His fight is not just with the nobleman who wronged him, but also with the Leviathan that protects and enables that nobleman and whose very structure is used as an apparatus of oppression. Kolhaas's taking up of arms is similar to what Jünger in the Forced Passage refers to as, quote, the substance of the old Germanic freedom, illustrated by the social democrat who turned his gun on auxiliary policemen as they invaded his home. End quote. And I paraphrase that a little bit. But the armed resistance to the violation of inviolable rights is at the heart of Jünger's vision of the forced rebel. The dark side of this is fairly obvious. It can be seen in knee-jerk inclinations to calls for violence to counter exaggerated or at times even imaginary infringement of rights. It should also not be overlooked that Kolhaas's rebellion results in the deaths of innocent people. These are not ancillary deaths or even what some would call collateral damage, but deliberate and cold-blooded murders. Of course, Karl Moor's descent into criminality and atrocity is far more rapid and extreme. After he's deprived, we're switching to The Robbers by Schiller. After he's deprived of his title and inheritance, Moor falls in with a band of robbers and quickly becomes their leader. If relating Robber Moor to the principled forest rebel of Jünger seems at first dubious, please consider that Moor is rebelling not only against his family and the law, but what he sees as the shortfallings of the society in which he finds himself. When we first meet Moor, he is lamenting the age of heroes described by Plutarch, that states that he is disgusted with this, quote, age of scribblers. He goes on, declaring his time, quote, an age of eunuchs, fit for chewing over the deeds of bygone days, mutilating the heroes of old with their learned interpretations and mocking them up with their tragedies. The strength of the loins is dried up, and the dregs of the beer barrel must help to propagate mankind, end quote. Moore finds his society both decadent and dominated by law, and thus the individual was cut off for his capacity for freedom and heroic greatness that was available in the mythic past. Karl Moor seeks a radical freedom in his camaraderie with the band of criminals, and through his resistance to the state, he sees his oppressing natural freedom. While his rebellion is at first purely personal, he hopes and believes, arguably in a delusional manner, that his influence on others could result in a greater nation. He proclaims, give me an army of fellows like me to command, and I'll make Rome and Sparta look like nunneries, end quote. This is not simply a hypermasculine and messianic delusion of grandeur, and it is definitely that, but also a declaration of hoping that somehow a more virtuous society be created through the rejection of the current sick society. That would also presume that Rome and Sparta would be a better society. We'll give them a little leeway there. The sentiment is comparable to Jünger's statements that the forced rebel need not necessarily change society, but that his example can inspire others and lead to change. Moor's idealism, of course, is dealt a serious blow once he must deal with the actual methods of the revolt he rejoins and subsequently comes to lead, and that's atrocity and barbarism. Jünger, too, prescribes that his ideal forest rebel, engaging in outright banditry, but it's hard to think of examples of armed resistors who, by their very nature, are contrary to the law, and whether they are engaged in internal resistance against the state or against an occupying force that does not engage in tactics that are unseemly to the average civilian. Indeed, war and rebellion are nasty businesses. A later and more mature work of Schiller may contain a prototype of the forest rebel that more directly corresponds to Jünger's ideal. The titular hero of William Tell, displays the characteristics of the forest rebel without any of the problematic behaviors of Kolhaas and Moor. Indeed, Jünger himself mentions Tell as an example of the forest rebel arising from amongst the people rather than from the elite. I should say that Jünger thinks of the forest rebel by their nature as being elite, but when we say elite, meaning not coming from, say, the aristocracy.
and whose challenge to the oppressive power of the state and makes his countrymen, quote, aware of their own native power over the oppressor, end quote. It is crucial that the forced rebel acts of his own accord and as an individual. He is neither a rabble-rouser nor one swept up in the passion of the crowd. From the beginning of the play, Tell is depicted as a member of the Switzer community, but also apart. He teaches his son self-reliance, educates him culturally, and more importantly, teaches him that a life free of dependence on and oppression by the state is their ideal, and the reason that they must reside in the forest, mountains, as opposed to a life outside the hardships found there. Tell is a free-thinking individual and rejects both the comfort of living in conformity and the relative safety of numbers in rebellion. Despite his anti-authoritarian nature, Tell does not join the rebellious Confederacy. Further, he rebels when his conscience is offended, not simply because the injustice now affects him. Tell's rebellion may have the same motivations as the Confederacy formed by the cantons, but he is not amongst their number. Tell's use of violence when it comes is far different from that of Kolhaas and Moore's. Tell's violence is limited, calculated, and strategic. The violence of Kolhaas and Moore is closer to that of a purging mob. There's a Dionysian element to the anarchic violence of Karl Moore in particular, and his band of criminals are far from the sober actions of Tell. The sovereignty of the forced rebel comes at a great price. Operating outside the law and otherwise indifferent to law, the rebel can easily find himself outside its protection in a condition similar to Agamben's bare life, or at the very least, subject to harsh judicial punishment. Once again, Jünger. The resistance of the forced rebel is absolute. He knows no neutrality, no pardon, no fortress confinement. He does not expect the enemy to listen to arguments, let alone act chivalrously. In taking his position in resistance, the rebel is conscripting himself to an existence of radical solitude and sacrifice. We see this as well with both Kolhaas and Moore, as the rebellion estranges them not only from their families, but also of society in general. After being taken into custody, they can expect no quarter. It is only Tell, of the rebels analyzed here, who escapes this fate. So where do we find Jünger's forced rebel in the forms of war today? Seemingly everywhere there is conflict. We certainly see Jünger's forced rebel reflected in the conflict in Ukraine. In the first conventional war of its kind, that's wrong. As in the first conventional war, that's obviously not true. In the first recent conventional war of its kind in that region, a crucial element of the conflict was individuals acting on their own to fight and sacrifice for specific notions, particularly the sovereignty of their nation. This could, in part, assuage fears that have proliferated over the years that liberalism, neoliberalism, globalism, materialism have stomped much of this out, and individuals are no longer to sacrifice outside their immediate self-interest. Indeed, sacrifice unites all of the rebels analyzed herein, and that sacrifice is always great, if not total. In the domestic context, the forced rebel takes another form, particularly at a time when elements of both the left and the right view the government to be antagonistic, if not engaged in outright war against its own people. There is, at the time of writing, frequent accusations from the right of the government agents being weaponized against political dissenters. Further, Fourth Amendment protections have been eroded, and there's good reason to believe they will continue to erode due specifically to advances in technology and diminishing expectations of privacy. On the left, we notice that the police forces are militarized. They carry military-grade weapons and equipment. More disturbingly, as outlined by Bernard Harcourt in The Counter-Revolution, law enforcement utilizes counterinsurgency tactics while policing American neighborhoods. This makes political resistance all the more daunting. When I say counterinsurgency techniques, this isn't just the method of clearing buildings or occupying territory. We're talking more about total surveillance, bulk intelligence gathering, targeted strikes, and propaganda that's meant to pacify the occupied. Think here of, I don't know if you guys have it in New York, it's big where I live, Shop with a Cop.
They take kids from the ghetto, the housing projects where there's a heavy police, and they take them to Toys R Us and buy them a toy in uniform. And that the idea is see, we're not all bad. We locked up your dad. But here's a squirt gun, you know, and pacifying propaganda. Where was I? All right, so
I'll give you an extra minute.
So anyhow, the contemporary force rebel would do well to follow the example of Tell rather than that of Kolhaas and Moore. Despite the obvious moral difference in Tell's avoidance of wanton bloodshed, Tell is able to maintain his integrity by refusing to join a confederacy despite being facially sympathetic to their stated goals. The force rebel's rebellion stems from an internal theological conviction, and he does not need a political manifesto or ideology to guide him or speak for him. Jünger was no doubt familiar with the works mentioned here, and certainly lived through a time of great violence and oppression. To the extent that he lived according to the precepts espoused in the Forced Passage is best debated by historians and biographers. The text, however, offers great insight into the resistance in the contemporary as much, if not possibly more, than at the time of writing. Resistance is far more complicated and difficult now that the possibility of total surveillance is very real, and much of what passes as organized resistance is merely political posturing or lip service. Further, and also significant for today's dissenters, the forced rebels' resistance is not intended to further a specific political agenda or advancement of an identity. Rather, it comes out of allegiance to the sacred elements of life. It is the preservation of these sacred elements of aspects of life for which Jünger's force rebel fights, be it against an invading despot or bureaucratic totalitarianism. That's all I have for you.
We'll take a couple of questions right now for Beau. Does anyone have anything to ask him? Russell?
Thanks for your paper. Can I just speak up?
Yeah.
I will just speak up. Forest rebel. Can you elaborate a little bit on your suggestion that in Ukraine there were forest rebel partisans in addition to regular Ukrainian troops?
Yes, sir. I've read some, I think the New York Times did an article on partisan fighters in Ukraine. Additionally, people living in the occupied portions of Ukraine during the beginning of the war that were essentially acting as partisan spies and actually, I think, assassinating collaborators and military officers. So I don't have any specific, documentation of it, but from what I've read, that it did occur. In addition to regular troops, also irregular troops, in particular at the beginning of the war in occupied territory.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Anything else? David? Go ahead. Or Mike?
One thing that comes up when you compare the Jünger with the older texts is the way in which the older texts, when Kleist is writing, for instance, he's writing about something that's even, he's writing in the early 19th century about it's like 16th century, 15th century, and this was this was a period where there's this kind of transition from kind of feudal order to law, right? And so there's this issue of like the status of law even, right? And I'm kind of wondering, feudalism, basically there's no state law, right? And all you have is kind of like, feuds, right? Somebody gives offense somehow, and the response, the only response, is not to take them to court, but to shoot his messenger, or go and attack him or something like that. But I'm just, the point being that in this other notion of a kind of non-law, but a different basis for right, there's this presumption of a kind of the autonomy of the, whatever, the free night or whatever you call it, right? And I'm just wondering about, in Junger's context, what's the status of the forest rebel? Is the forest rebel somehow this sort of autonomous, I don't know what you call it, right? But this is the autonomous rebel, right? Yes, its own sovereign.
I would think so, yeah.
Or I mean, but there's this alternative, right? Because like the Schmittian partisan is not his own sovereign. He's always linked to some regular force, in a sense. I mean, either an existing regular force, like the Marxist rebels in some whatever in Bolivia, right? Who are linked up with the Soviets or something like that. And that's I'm just kind of wondering about that tension, I guess, between the lone sovereign. Is that a kind of fantasy in a sense, or is that a kind of a stand-in for the sovereign that's backed up by the, whatever, the communists or whatever?
Well, I would push back a little bit against the claim that Kolhaas takes place at a time before the law, right?
No, it's not.
There's a lawsuit.
No, it's clearly in this transition period, right? And that's why there's a conflict, right?
Okay, and yeah, it could be that the forest rebel is a unattainable and impractical ideal, right? What's to say is he's simply not just an outlaw, right? That for whatever reason decides to shirk his responsibilities and his, the need to behave normally in society, right? So that's part of the danger of saying that, like I'm acting outside the law, outside of its oppression, and yeah, like so with the partisan, Schmidt wrote about partisans, and I think they would definitely be connected to some type of movement or a government that funds them, right. Whatever. But this is almost an anarchic individual removing himself from society, I guess you could say.
All right.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah.
All right, now, we're now going to move on to the next paper. Any other questions, please save them for the end. We're now moving on to Mario Bosincu. Sorry, thank you. All right, and on Junger's war as inner experience, and this is without drugs. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
I think so. Anyway.
In 1922, Ernst Jünger published an essay entitled Battle as Inner Experience that may be considered as the culminating point of his psychological reflections on the First World Conflict. First of all, Jünger depicted the pre-war Wilhelmine society in Spenglerian terms as a lifeless civilization in which a Nietzschean last man led an over-intellectualized life centered on meaningless, quote, activities and pleasures, end quote, and characterized by an inner void demanding to be filled. Carl Gustav Jung traced this de-intensification of life back to the estrangement from man's instinctual sphere effected by Christianity. In his 1918 essay on the role of the unconscious, he wrote, quote, Christianity split the Germanic barbarian into an upper and a lower half and enabled him, by repressing the dark side, to domesticate the brighter half. But the lower, darker half still awaits redemption and a second spell of domestication. Until then, it will remain associated with the collective unconscious, which is subject to a peculiar and ever-increasing activation. As the Christian view of the world loses its authority, the more menacingly will the blonde beast be heard prowling about in its underground prison, ready at any moment to burst out with devastating consequences. End quote. Jünger sensed the stirring of this inner psychic beast. In fact, in his reconstruction of the pre-war psychological atmosphere, he remarked that a barbarian, quote, naked and rough like the steppe and forest man, end quote, had lurked deep in the recesses of the Belle Epoque man, beneath the patina of civilization made up of instinctual restraints. At the same time, he interpreted the modern man's predicament through a concept central to the life ideology, identified by Martin Lindner as the meta-discourse underlying German culture between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The idea of the crisis, i.e. of the experience of life's alienation from its psychic depths. This concept represents in its turn the modern psychological form of the Gnostic idea of the pre-cosmic fall from the divine pleroma and from a metaphysical condition of plenitude and of wholeness. This does not mean that Jünger knew and consciously drew on a Gnostic conceptual apparatus to make sense of the modern man's plight. On the contrary, it means that the modern relapse into Gnosticism has its very roots in modernity itself. Indeed, Erich Voegelin's contention that the essence of modernity is the growth of Gnosticism may be refined and nuanced by observing that the modern age, giving birth to a self-divided and self-estranged subject, has induced him to think in categories that display structural affinities with the Gnostic ones in order to understand himself. Just as, according to Luciano Pellicani, capitalism based upon calculative rationality and intent on the rationalization and marketization of society has caused a messianic and apocalyptic frame of mind to re-emerge in the political form of revolutionary ideologies in opposition to modern evils, so it may be argued that modern society has engendered a new gnosis, that is to say, a form of thought isomorphic to ancient Gnosticism in order to become aware of itself and of the modern man's plight, and to work out the ways of overcoming it. In this regard, a passage from Nietzsche's third untimely meditation on Schopenhauer as educator sheds light on the neo-Gnostic structure of Nietzsche's thought. He described the man of Rousseau as follows, quote, "Ruined by priests and bad education, man cries in his distress to holy nature, and suddenly feels that it is as distant from him as any Epicurean god. His prayers do not reach it, so deeply is he sunk in the chaos of unnaturalness, das Chaos der Unnatur. And when he cries, only nature is good, only the natural is human, he despises himself and longs to go beyond himself." End quote. In the first place, man's predicament results from a fall from a pleromatic condition, i.e., in secularized and immanentistic terms, from an alienation process initiated by the evil demiurges, represented by priests and educators, as well as by civilization itself, who have denaturalized man, thereby estranging them from an immanentized pleroma, their full and unblemished nature. The turning point in the Gnostic narrative of fall and redemption is the moment in which the addressee of the revelation message becomes aware of his wretched condition, rebels against his subjectivity form shaped by civilization, and begins to search for the core of his real self, concealed by the alienating incrustations sedimented by society. The Gnostic return to the pneumatic divinity is thus replaced by the modern, secularized, immanentized, and psychicized neo-Gnostic return to one's innermost nature. With regard to this process, Nietzsche wrote in Twilight of the Idols, quote, "Progress in my sense. Even I speak of a return to nature. although it is actually not a going back, but a coming up into high, free, even fearful nature and naturalness. But Rousseau, where did he actually want to go back to? Rousseau, that first modern man, wanted a return to nature. End quote. In Nietzsche's view, the real progress is therefore a regression to nature in its unbridled instinctual fullness. Nietzsche therefore provides in Schopenhauer as Educator and in Twilight of the Idols an answer to a precise question. What does it mean to be modern? In this regard, Nietzsche's thesis that Rousseau was the first modern man is revealing. In Nietzsche's eyes, the modern man is thus not he who tries to invent himself, to use Michel Foucault's definition of the Baudelairean dandy as the figure paradigmatic of the modern ascesis, but a he who is forced by his alienated condition to work on himself to recover himself. Carl Gustav Jung's views on the psychic dynamics underlying history serve to clarify Ernst Jünger's interpretation of the First World War as an unconscious-driven process of self-recovery. According to the Swiss psychologist, the intensification of a one-sided conscious attitude always triggers a compensatory reaction on the part of the collective unconscious. This reaction, in its turn, takes on the form of the constellation of an archetype whose effects on man are described by Jung by recourse to Rudolf Otto's phenomenology of the numinous. As Jung put it in Psychology and Religion, quote, "Religion is a careful and scrupulous observation of what Rudolf Otto aptly termed the numinosum, that is, a dynamic agency or effect not caused by an arbitrary act of will. On the contrary, it seizes and controls the human subject, who is always rather its victim than its creator." End quote. In other words, Jung identified the experience of the numinous with the experience of an energy-laden archetype manifesting itself through a mythological figure and capable of overpowering man. Accordingly, in an essay entitled Wotan, he interpreted the rise of Nazism as a religious and archetypal phenomenon. In his view, the modern, quote, hubris of consciousness had led in Germany to a compensatory reaction in the form of the reactivation of the archetype of the ancient German god of warlike frenzy. The German people was therefore, quote, ergriffen, end quote, seized and subjugated by an unconscious force and experienced what Jung called a kairos, the archetypal term characterized by the self-enthrallment of a new god. In his 1957 essay on present and future, Jung wrote, quote, "We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols," end quote. At the same time, it is worth stressing that for Jung, these inner transformations, such as the return to the Wotanistic frenzy in Nazi Germany, took place independently of man's will. In other words, for Jung, the neo-Gnostic return to neglected psychic layers is a process one undergoes, and the modern man, therefore, is not he who actively recovers himself, but he on whom psychic components to be recovered force themselves in order to restore him to wholeness. The modern man, in Jung's view, is he who experiences the return of an archaic archetypal dimension. This interpretation of the modern man's predicament lies at the center of Ernst Jünger's battle as inner experience, which also prefigures the idea of the great passage that is developed in his late autobiographical essay entitled Approaches, Drugs and Altered States, and that displays remarkable affinities with Jung's conception of the kairos. Ernst Jünger distinguishes between the lesser passage, kleiner Übergang, entailing a mere transformation of social institutions, and the great passage, grosser Übergang, during which, quote, formless, undifferentiated substance is brought up from the ground, end quote, and which concerns, quote, the symbol world in general, end quote. The great passage thus marks the rise of what Jünger explicitly designates in his essay on stones as, quote, archetypal images, end quote, which emerge from the unconscious. Hence the Göttersturz, the overthrow of the ruling gods and the advent to power of other deities that imply, quote, turning points for the historical world, end quote.
Sorry, 1 minute, please.
Yes. In his essay on battle as inner experience, Jünger describes the outbreak of the First World Conflict as a great passage arising from the compensatory reorientation of an over-rationalized generation toward his psychic counterpole. This process is also thematized in the short story Sturm, whose protagonist reflects on his enrollment as follows, quote, what had thrust him into the army? It was the war which he had carried in his blood like any other real son of his time. Long before, a fiery beast, he entered the actual arena, for the intellect had become too refined. The mysterious pendulum that resides in everything alive, that ineffable world reason, had suddenly swung to the other side, end quote. Thank you.
Okay, please.
Thank you so much. And should I wait for the microphone or just speak?
You want to use mine? Or?
Whatever you prefer. I can just.
She's coming. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
Mario, that was an amazing paper. Thank you so much. And I am fascinated by your psycho-spiritual, I guess I would call it, orientation on the questions of modern Gnosticism and otherwise. I have a two-part question on that psycho-spiritual dimension. The first part is Freud somewhere part of the equation as well in terms of perhaps what is being reacted against? Whether thinking of the time frame in which Jünger is thinking about or at least implying the Gnostic dimensions of modernity, even if he doesn't articulate it as such. So is Freud part of the self-divided consciousness of modern humanity? Well, I'll put it that way. And then the other one, Joe Bendersky was telling me yesterday about correspondence that I had not known between Vogelin and Schmidt. Was there any kind of engagement between Vogelin and Jung that you know of? So just those two aspects. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would say that Freud's psychology is part of this theory about the necessity of recovering a hidden dimension. Think of the fact that the Traumdeutung, the interpretation of dreams, opens with a quote from Virgil's Aeneis. That is, acheronta movebo. So Freud himself was conscious of the fact that he was undertaking a descensus ad inferos, a journey into the underworld, no? And I don't know if there was a connection between Vogelin and Jung, but they shared an interest in gnosis, although they studied it from different perspectives.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If there are no more question? Oh, sorry, Russell, go ahead.
What's the game show? We have to formulate something as a question. I'm having a hard time turning this into a question, but I think in Jung there's a reaction against Freud, and that Freud is calling for the imposition of the rational, which is exactly what Jünger is trying to escape in the Großer Übergang. So I suppose you could say there's an anti-Freudian gesture going on here, although I have no proof that Jünger is thinking about Freud at all. It would sort of surprise me if he were. And with regard to gnosis and Gnosticism, it cuts in different ways. As a secret knowledge, it has an element of the irrational. But for Vogelin, of course, this is the source of modern totalitarianism, beginning with Cromwell. Right? Cromwell, Nazis, Stalinists, this mass mobilization in order to make heaven on earth. I would see Jünger, in the end of the day, as an anti-Gnostic, precisely because, well, not only because of his distance from the National Socialists, but also because his journey, his trip, right, is into a spiritual space.
Yes.
A spiritual space in approaches via LSD. It's bizarre. This guy is 1 degree of separation away from Timothy Leary. He talks about how he would like to be on the island with Timothy Leary. Right? And he ends up doing a late-of-life conversion to Catholicism.
Okay, actually, could you save it to the end, please? No problem. I just want to move on to the next paper. We have, Camelia Raghinaru, thank you, from Concordia. She's presenting a paper on war as a unifying experience in Valentyn Vasanovich's reflection.
Thank
Please.
you. Does this, yeah, okay. So thank you so much for the conference. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed yesterday and today. There is a traditional view of war based on the idea that waging war serves as a guarantee for peace. And even in the post-1945 nuclear era, this belief continues. As Ian Morris posits, war itself has had a massively benign, quote-unquote, effect for mankind, and productive warfare puts a premium on cooperation and societies organized in such a way as to reduce the risk for violence. Paul Schurman lists the following ways in which war is a paradoxical phenomenon. A willingness to wage war serves as a guarantor for peace. War itself, not just being prepared for it, has had a benign effect on people, despite its immediate negative impact. And according to this view, war produces prosperous and peaceful societies. It stimulates virtues that benefit the internal development of a society. And politics is geared towards the purpose of war. The idea is that war functions as the prime motive for cooperation and stands at the origin of the first types of societies, which were military ones. As Schurman notes, quote, "A pacifist needs clinical eyes before he is prepared to appreciate the positive effects of carnage," end of quote. He concludes that war starts off by making a paradoxically positive contribution to a society initially, but that contribution decreases at a later stage when warfare becomes dysfunctional. So in the context of war as a traumatic experience with nonetheless positive effects, I would like to discuss this 2021 film by Valentyn Vasyanovych on the 2014 war, Russo-Ukrainian war, but kind of put a different emphasis on the effects of war in terms of the inner transformation of somebody who goes through war and the war as an event of a mystical encounter, resulting in a mystical encounter with God. Briefly, the film is about Serhiy, a medical surgeon who volunteers to fight in the 2014 war. He's captured by the Russians, incarcerated, interrogated, tortured, and forced to assist in the torture and death of other prisoners of war. He is later released after a false confession of guilt. And the rest of the film focuses on Serhiy's return to his life through a series of repetitive tableaus, and repetition is kind of the structuring formalism of the film. During these final scenes, Serhiy and his daughter talk about the resurrection of the body and the liberation of the soul from the prison of the body in the afterlife. Invoking both Christian and Buddhist beliefs, Serhiy tells his daughter that God has the power to reintegrate and resurrect a new body out of atoms and dust, just like he did in the creation of the universe. Post-war, Serhiy is both traumatized but also imbued with a deep sense of meaning, even though he withdraws from his previous occupations, including his profession. The event that constitutes Serhiy as a subjectivity is the war itself. There is a sense that without the war, he would have continued to live an empty, alienated, and meaningless life, and that's suggested at the beginning of the film, that he lives kind of without purpose. War is the eventual break of his status quo, a force of becoming that reasserts his desire to live. The war acts as a way to strip Serhiy of his disillusionments and resentments, his regrets and previous losses. Repetition, all the second half of the film is a series of formal repetitions, is Serhiy's way of overcoming his nihilism. And I was trying to work with Kierkegaard's idea of repetition. So this nihilism is Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage of a melancholic return to the past. In the aftermath of his trauma, Serhiy is forced to confront the fact that meaning is inherent in each repetitive moment of being. This underlines the paradoxical nature of war, as Serhiy goes, in a way similar to the biblical story of Job, from complete destruction to restoration of everything he had lost to more than his initial state. War itself, while operating through nihilistic destructive means, obtains at the same time the increased restoration of previous conditions that had been lost in the time of peace. And to a greater degree, not in spite of its destructiveness, but precisely through it, Serhiy regains not only a sense of himself, but also his lost family. And there is a twist of the plot where before the war, his ex-wife and daughter had formed their own family. She was married to Andriy. So in the torture chamber, Serhiy assists at Andriy's torture and euthanizes him. So after the war, he regains his previous family, his ex-wife and daughter. For Jan Patočka, what is the result and also the solution to the problem of decadence in the post-metaphysical age? Mihaela Beleshkanikova notes in her reading of Patočka that war is, quote, a radical breakthrough event, a radical moment of liberation from previous conditions, the establishment of peace or bestowal of a new meaning, end of quote. Patočka co-opts Jünger's vision of the war of total mobilization to take a more critical view of the war. Following Heidegger's critique, he points out that techno-civilization closes off the modern consciousness to meaning. Technology places humans in a relationship to truth that is distorted, alien, and unfamiliar. James Dodd notes that for Patočka, the goal is no longer to regain a lost familiarity to truth that has since been distorted, but to gain a familiarity of another kind. In the vision of the film, this is regained by syncretizing death and violence with self-sacrifice into a new relation to being. This underscores the aporetic human condition deeply intertwined with the meaninglessness that structures it. Self-sacrifice is a contested category, though. On one hand, it can render life meaningful. On the other, as Dodd notes, it can be construed as a cynical ruse to reinforce meaninglessness. For Patočka, the reduction of human life to expenditure of force in the logic of total mobilization belies the gesture of sacrifice. Bodies in Vasyanovich's film are vulnerable either way. They are vulnerable to torture, death, and destruction in times of war, but they are also vulnerable during conditions of peace. There is an intimation at the end of the film that bodies actively seek death and violence to feel alive during conditions of peace when they are alienated, depressed, and nihilistic. Along with Teilhard de Chardin, Patočka points to a different solution to resist the expenditure of human life in the logic of technocratic total mobilization. And that is the binding of human identity to the mythico-religious. Humans can embrace their condition in the age of techno-civilization and find redemption in two places, in art and conflict. They link us to, these two categories link us to sacrifice, to something mysterious at work that restores us to a transcendental connection and remove us from the world of utility and survival. I return to the idea of repetition at this point in order to underscore the link between repetition and trauma. Compulsive repetition is one of the markers of trauma representation, the attempt to make sense of the void at the core of trauma that escapes representation. The question of repetition for Kierkegaard is the question of capturing transcendence in the flux of being, in the cycle of crisis, when instead of giving up, one perseveres through trauma. When instead of becoming weary of the burden of living, one returns to the starting point and tries again. Repetition is a religious movement for Kierkegaard because it involves the transformation of the inward being, when through loss, one maintains faith to one's calling and perseveres until something new is created from the same old motions. Repetition is the only way to move from trauma to avoid being stuck, and Serhij's life after his incarceration is going through motions as if coming to grips with the fear and trembling of daily life lived amid the precarious flux of being. In the midst of repetition, he is one of Patočka's shaken, who is learning to have compassion and solidarity with the other shaken. He is exercising care for the soul, his own and that of his family. He cannot move into a new future because that would become discontinuous with his past. The movement of repetition involves his pressing forward into the same individual and destiny that he already is and has, and not into something new that he has to become. John Caputo notes that, quote, by repetition, the individual becomes himself, circling back on the being which he has been all along. Repetition is that by which the existing individual becomes what he was to be, that by which he returns to himself, end of quote. Repetition is a religious task because it transforms Serhij's identity. Caputo says that it's a transformation of the individual in which something new and transcendent is produced. It is an inward attempt to put order into ceaseless change, into life as a series of disasters, which is why Caputo concludes repetition is not possible, and even genuine religious repetition is constantly deferred. The critical point of religious repetition, according to Caputo, which Serhij succeeds in doing, is to surrender to divine power and divine action, to surrender one's sense of self-sufficiency and put himself at God's disposal. For Serhij, the beauty of faith, hope, and love is possible only as the result of war and torture and not before. Just as for Patočka, the solidarity of the shaken, a type of community emerging out of the war, is the way to overcome the state of war. And that also involves sacrifice and metanoia, two religious concepts as part of the attempt to counter modern decadence and nihilism. For Patočka, quote, the frontline experience has the capacity to become an event which can change the entire course of history. It has a capacity to transcend humanity and save it from the dangers of total mobilization, end of quote. Beleshkanikova, too, thinks of war as a, quote, radical breakthrough event, a radical moment of liberation from previous conditions, the establishment of peace or bestowal of a new meaning, end of quote. She describes a twofold trajectory for the participants of war. The first one is the moment of self-surrender and depersonalization in which, quote, one overcomes one's individuality, end of quote, which applies to Serhiy in the torture chamber. Second, the survivor of war undergoes a transcendental encounter with something greater, which Patočka termed something, quote unquote, deeply and mysteriously positive. This particular type of insight can only come from death and destruction, and Patočka does not glorify the powerful sense of enthusiasm of the young soldiers themselves, as Jünger does, but rather the encounter with the transcendence. Teilhard de Chardin describes the same phenomenon as going deep within the self to experience a power of a new kind that results in a sense of, quote, hallowed unity with mankind, end of quote. The war provides answers to this anxious questioning of the self by releasing from the depth of our nature a living spring of moral intensity and beauty. This is the intensity of newness of hope, which amounts to a discovery of abundant inner resources, where previously Serhiy was aware only of spiritual poverty, loss, and alienation. De Chardin notes that there is a special kind of energy that emerges when one directs one's force towards a common good and no longer perceives oneself in isolation. He sees the common effort of soldiers fighting together in the war as the occasion for, quote, an extraordinary release of spiritual energy, end of quote, that cannot happen during times of peace. De Chardin doesn't deny that a proliferation of vice is a result of this ordeal as well, and in the film we see the inhumanity of the Russian torturers as this depravity of evil. But Serhiy emerges out of this experience with trauma, but also a cosmic consciousness of a union with the Absolute. Patočka needs a vision of individuality that does not continue the logic of war into times of peace, but only the logic of spiritual overcoming, which emerges out of war but seeks to overcome war. He uses this religious term of metanoia, a radical change of mind, as a result of an encounter with the divine mystery, followed by an overwhelming sense of meaningfulness, even though it is arrived at through what amounts to an eschatological experience. It is this post-traumatic spiritual conversion that is also captured in the process of repetition as an attempt to come to grip with the flux of life and its disasters. But repetition has to be inward, Caputo notes. Outward repetition is aesthetic, not religious, because it requires variation and it becomes futile. True repetition is not aesthetic, but religious in nature. Both Kierkegaard and Caputo echo this paradox when they note that religious repetition happens by virtue of the absurd. It is a matter of faith. The meaning of religious repetition is to persevere in the face of adversity with the persistence of Job. I will end with Caputo's words, who says that, quote, the hand of God is playing with man in order to humble his finite understanding and lead him into another and transcendent sphere. Repetition is reached not by achieving ethical steadfastness, but by realizing that, from a human standpoint, everything is lost, that there is nowhere to turn. Thank you.
That was perfect, right on the dot. Anyway, questions, answers? Yeah, please.
Excellent treatment of Kierkegaard and, Kierkegaard and repetition. I'm just going to speak up. Oh, okay.
Feedback.
Yeah.
It's like a cosmic conspiracy.
My question is that with Caputo's treatment of repetition and Kierkegaard, Caputo is famous for a very weak theology. As you conclude, humanly speaking, everything is lost. There's no hope. Everything is left up to this very apophatic transcendence. But in Kierkegaard, whenever I read Kierkegaard's own treatment of religious repetition, he treats it as a firm foundation in the midst of the world, a very positive foundation, as it were. So I guess my question is, do you think there is a more constructive understanding of repetition to be found that avoids, without avoiding the necessity of sacrifice, maybe avoids some of the, in my opinion, overly weak tendencies or even masochistic, theologically masochistic tendencies that we might find in Caputo.
In the context of the film, I wanted to work with this weaker version of repetition because I wanted to keep in tension that there is actual trauma and you cannot just get over it. So he's kind of stuck in that repetitive, circling back to the beginning and then trying to forge a new path and then returning back to the traumatic point. But there is something new that emerges out of that as well.
Yeah.
Like, and he literally gets a new life. He drops his profession. He gets back his ex-wife, his daughter. He gets this understanding of a resurrection and this kind of overwhelming sense of meaning. He doesn't do anything with his days other than just go through each moment.
Yeah.
And then there's all these beautiful repetitive tableaus. And there's a lot of symbolism. I had a part of the paper that I excised. It's this psychoanalytical theory of the mourner and the melancholic. And so the mourner, actually, this is Amy Allen, I think. She talks about the mourner who raises the object of mourning to the dignity of a lost thing and then escapes in a symbolic creative act to repair the self, whereas the melancholic incorporates and internalizes the lost object and regresses into this fantasy of the past and cannot let go of it. And then she kind of made a cool connection to populism. This is kind of off point, but right-wing populism is oriented towards the past, trying to retrieve this lost golden age. And the dictum is, what I lost, I cannot have again. And left-wing populism, she says, it's utopian, pushing forward to a perceived golden age. I want it all. So I was trying to avoid the melancholic stage of, I want it all, even though he gets it in the end, but he's still stuck in that weak mourning, grieving process.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. So I'm thinking about, there seems to be a kind of clash, even, incommensurability between this individual level of the hero in the film and then your reflection of it, right, with Patočka and Kierkegaard. I mean, the person who experiences this war, I don't know the film, but I mean, how is that person different than what we hear of someone who's, has cancer and recovers from that, right? And then suddenly all those aspects that seemed superficial in the past, now there's a new meaning, right, that he takes for himself, right? So that's at a very individual level, and I don't know what war adds to that. And then, with Patočka, who's, of course, writing in Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia, after World War II, for the most part, right? Reflecting on that, reflecting on this war that he did not participate in heroically, right? But then it's a fact and he's dealing with it for his country, what we can take out of that. I mean, he's not looking at the individual level at all, right? So, I guess I'm not sure of the question here, but it just, I guess well, you see, I'm not convinced that there's a connection between those two levels, almost like two different stories, right? And I'm not sure why the first one is related to the second. Thanks.
I guess the question I'm hearing is, why war? Why does war have to be this exceptional situation and not any other kind of suffering that is transformative? Right. Yeah. So that's a good question, and what I can come up with is, I think of war as a complete rupture with the status quo, and it's an individual but also a collective experience, and it does fundamentally transform not just the individual but the whole society around the individual. And it also creates this opportunity for heroism in a way that is also thwarted, because he's not a hero. He's just a medical surgeon. He's captured, he's tortured, he's released. He doesn't do anything heroic. But I guess there is something heroic about the recovery of the self after that. And yeah, so I think the film plays on both grounds, the individual level and the collective experience. It's kind of symbolic of the Ukrainian, I mean, sir, he's Ukrainian, so it's symbolic of the Ukrainian people. So it kind of compresses that whole symbolism about a nation at war in this one individual. I don't know if that's convincing, but that's all I got.
Great. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks once again for a really wonderful set of papers. I wanted to get back to the forest rebel concept for a second. I'm extremely intrigued by just that figure, thinking not just about the way you described it in that transitional moment between feudalism and the modern that David mentioned, but connected more to your 21st century and more modern ways of maybe thinking about the relationship between ecology and violence and subjectivity. The 20th anniversary of the Iraq War was timed with a report by the IPCC almost within the same week that said if we don't get down to about a 1.5 degree temperature increase the next decade, the kinds of wars we're going to be experiencing are not going to be wars traditionally conceived. They're going to be ecological wars of resource scarcity. They're going to extend beyond traditional nation-state boundaries, and to change the entire way that we think about agency and violence, and specifically nature. They're not alone. I mean, I think it is now, at least since Obama, official military strategic doctrine to think about climate change as a force multiplier, possibly even a key force multiplier in the future. So I was going to ask, in the text that you've mentioned, are there any examples where, rather than just seeming to be a sort of passive retreat for the forest rebel to express this distance from traditional nation-state, civil society, kinds of connections, where there is agency in some places within, the ecological or natural world? I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be put in climate change terms. If you read Clausewitz on the People's War or Mao, or if you read some other insurgency, documents, they're very keen on the mobilization of the terrain itself, as having agency. Even the Hudson River here, the lower Adirondacks look like they were just fit perfectly for the way that the colonialist rebels used them to defeat the British. So I was just wondering, whether the ecological realm itself had agency in some way. And then there's just one more quick question, and I'll just put that out there. Thinking about the partisan, it seems to me that one of the questions the IPCC raises, as well as the people interested in climate change as a force multiplier, is that this new form of war is going to create oppositions and allegiances that are new, that they go beyond just the usual ways of thinking about separations of nation states and national interest. And so I was wondering, along the lines of whether the partisan operates as a more anarchic Nietzschean force that Mario talked about, or there is some possible higher collective commonality that Camelia may have mentioned, even if that commonality is not quite clear in the form of an existing national paradigm.
I guess you could say that as opposed to the force rebel, the partisan is more of a regular irregular, if that makes any sense at all. They are, like David was saying, more organized than, say, the anarchic force rebel. And I think that would be the main distinction there. As far as I have not considered the ecological side of this. I know the forest, you're in the forest, you're out of sight, right? That's I guess the metaphor. You're outside the surveillance state in the forest. So I guess, and then the forest, is both literal and a metaphor in the forest passage, right? So in that the ecology of the forest shields the partisan, I think that would similar to that, right? But of course, we know that the guerrilla warfare is also urban. So maybe the metaphor is stronger than the actual cover that it gives the actual partisan.
Well, go back to, sorry.
I'd like to thank all of you for your presentations. I have a question for Mario, and I hope it doesn't sound too reductionist, but basically what I want to ask is if we are to look for a leading motive in Jünger's war's inner experience, would that be something like emphasis on something like a productive chaos as an aspect of nature, or maybe something else similar?
Yes. I think that in a sense, battle as inner experience may be considered as a commentary on Nietzsche's famous sentence, man muss noch Chaos in sich selbst haben, einen tanzenden Stern gewähren zu können. One has to harbor in himself chaos to be able to beget a star, a dancing star.
Thanks. Well, thank you. This is what I was thinking about.
Russell?
Again, thanks for all the papers. A comment on the nature question, and then I want to come to the film discussion. On nature, and Jünger and Forest Passage, Jünger in the 20s is very much a technophilia, but he's also throughout his life a naturalist, studying insects and beetles, very focused on the details of nature, and I think it's no accident that in his key novel On the Marble Cliffs, there's a magical, harmonious interaction with nature on the part of the very civilized, learned brothers. So he's not a Rousseauian back to nature person, but he does have this utopian model of a combination of civilization and nature. At the same time, the forest is a site of barbarism. Right. The Oberförster is the Hitler figure. So it gets complicated, but even later in his novels, in Eumerswil, the hero, the protagonist, hero is the wrong word, leaves the site of dictatorship and flees into the nature, into the jungle, it disappears into what is effectively a psychedelic jungle. So it's a complicated relationship to nature. Huh? I'm not sure if you could make an environmentalist argument out of that, but there is a nature sensibility. There's a nature sensibility which I think is a conservative sensibility, period, and in Jünger in particular, and contrasted with the famous line from Brecht, what times are these in which a discussion about trees is a crime. So this is the Marxist enunciation of the environmental discussion as a distraction from the class struggle. I don't know the film you were talking about, but as I understand it, there seems to be an argument being made not about the necessity of war, as little as you'd have a necessity of cancer, but rather, given war, what transpires. And what transpires is the emergence of forms of solidarity that transcend atomized individuality. So, as terrible as war is, it is not the site of absolute decadence as which it might otherwise be announced. Made me think of the the two films about the Heydrich assassination in Prague in 1940, help me here, 42. There was a Brecht long film, Hangmen Also Die, which is, I mean, it's very much a Marxist idiom film. Even there, though, of course, a national solidarity develops. But more apropos is the more recent film, Anthropoid, also about the same historical event, much more detailed in the in the account, and it includes what Brecht leaves out, and that is the death of the assassins, the death of the resistance figures in the church, where they had found shelter. So it'd fit into that discussion, I think.
Do you have a question back there? I'll get you next.
Yeah, I had a question for Beau. I haven't read the text that you commented by Jünger, but I remember that one of the recurring sentences, almost a leitmotif, in his writing in the 20s and the 30s, talking about assassinations, was his rejection of such plots. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more, because your comparison seemed to suggest that there was an element of wild, lawless violence, which would seem to, I mean, how do you reconcile that with Jünger's rejection of political assassinations, even during the Third Reich? He was informed of the plot against Hitler, but apparently was in principle against the idea.
And I think his objection to that would be, Jünger's coming from this old military tradition, and my gut feeling would be that he would think that the political assassinations are, unchivalrous, is I guess. But he uses William Tell in the Ernst, in the Forest Passage as one of the archetypes an example of a person acting individually outside of regular military operations, and that's the only act of violence that William Tell commits is exactly that, a political assassination. So I guess I can't reconcile that, and that's I take your question.
Thanks to all of you for a really insightful, nuanced panel. I guess my question is for Beau. Yesterday we were discussing the phenomenon or the question of the soldier who is in the field who does not believe in the cause. If you recall, a conscript or a kid who is a cannon fodder or anyway doesn't. So in my work on populism, I actually looked at a corpus of letters that American kids wrote back from Iraq. Which were enormously believing and inspired. We are here to bring freedom. Now, you could say, well, they all collectively lied in letters home to their parents. But I didn't get the feeling that they all could have collectively lied to their parents. By contrast, if I understand your paper, the rebel and the partisan believe. Right? They're not the soldiers. They're not the cannon fodder who don't know what they're doing there in the first place. And yet they are certainly not necessarily less dangerous or less warmongering than any other person on the war field. And so it seems to me that our response to that, to partisans and rebels, is cause dependent. If you like their cause, they're heroes, and if you don't, they're nutcases, right? And so I wondered if you could elaborate on what we're supposed to take from or learn from, for me, which is a very ambiguous cause-dependent figure of the rebel and the partisan in this discussion or in thinking about the subjective experience of war, but also the uses of war and the uses of belief in war, animating belief systems in the public or to persuade people to enlist. What are we supposed to take from these two figures?
That's a great question. In terms of the partisan, the force rebel, right? He has a great deal more agency than the average, conscript, and I think that's a huge difference there. And they elected into, now granted with the volunteer military, but I don't think you could say you elected into war, right? To a certain degree, but you have less agency when you're sent and lieutenant tells you to go where you go, and that you're right. That's the main difference. And the force rebel's acting according to his own conscience, and also I think it's important to put out that he is apart. Right? He is repelled from joining groups in general, and I was thinking of that in terms of political resistance and not joining groups and opting out of things because they subject you to the surveillance state, right? Things like social media and things like that. I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but that's not at all, right? No. Okay.
Not at all.
I just have to. I don't know what you could take from these particular.
Okay, we'll continue.
Or Joe, go ahead.
Okay. Two things. First, a quick response about Jünger and the assassination of Hitler. The issue with Jünger goes far beyond just the assassination. It's whether or not he should engage actively with the conspiracy at all, the resistance in general. He knew about it. He was in the center of it. His aide, Hans Speidel, was essentially the conduit for so much of what was going on. Later became one of the important figures in NATO. But so it wasn't just assassination. That's just a historical point there. My central question, though, is for the whole panel, and I would like to add my compliments to what others have already said here about this fine panel. And I would take special note of what Camelia said, because, or her entire focus on the themes, because so many of these discussions, everywhere, always circle back to Ernst Jünger, which is important, but you've expanded it beyond that, and I hope that your work will get broader exposure. My question is, and I don't know whether I should impose it on the panel here, because it deals with the entire conference, is that listening especially to Camille's question or paper here, it just joined in my mind, is that we're talking about the experience of war, but we're dealing with sort of, so far, the experience of war, certain intellectualization of it by particular figures. If we're really talking about forms of war and the experience of that, we are neglecting the experience of most soldiers who did not, intellectualize it this way. And we're talking primarily, in many examples here, about World War I. And in the aftermath of World War I, you had tens of millions of soldiers who talked this war experience, and the term was used, in different ways. And for many of them, when they looked around the suffering that they put on, they looked at the disabled veterans everywhere throughout society. To them, this wasn't this great existential experience of what you learned. It was a total mistake, a horrible waste, and that's what caused, cast, aspersions on civilization itself, not some, delving into the subconscious or whatever. And then on the other side, you had the war experience as a heroic one, but not in the self-realization aspect of a Jünger, but rather in a type of nationalistic heroism. And that the only problem was that we lost. And that if the country would again, this is almost a quote from Hans Zelter, if the country again would trust its young people, then once again we would recover that lost world. And the heroism and so on in it. So I was just, thought maybe the whole conference here, we're dealing about war and forms of war, and then missing a very important dimension.
David, you had a question? David, you had a question?
That was a question, by the way.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, I think that Jünger emphasized the spiritual dimension of war. He's interested in war as a mystic experience, in a sense. In the sense that war enables man to commune with psychic dimensions and with something which lies behind reality as we perceive it every day.
Nothing to add. Sorry.
David, you want to get a question? I think Russell's next. And
I guess my question is actually kind of similar to Joe's in a sense, that I'm just kind of wondering, when you all talk about kind of that subjective experience of war and the way in which war itself, yeah, you just mentioned it, has, at least for Jünger, has this sort of spiritual dimension to it just by itself as war, as opposed to, what Joe was mentioning, or I can't remember who was mentioning about Marcia was mentioning the letters home, that people were saying, oh yes, we're fighting the good fight, we're trying to establish these values and things, right? And I guess, I'm kind of wondering whether, Jünger's stance, because I mentioned the feudalism before, because the feudalism is not just about the individual, it's about affirming a whole system, right? Whereas with Jünger, it doesn't seem like he's affirming anything in particular, and besides just his own subjective autonomy,
values,
right? Well, spiritual value. No, there's no value that he points to. It seems, right? and so it's almost as if he's just affirming his own subjectivity in some sense. Kind of as opposed to, I guess, what you were talking about because you talked about sort of an experience of self-sacrifice, but I wasn't sure exactly what the goal of it was, and maybe you can explain that. But I was maybe, as far as Jünger, I was just kind of wondering if there's anything that he really affirms except himself in the end.
Well, yeah, I mean, the forced passage does seem to be a radical individual type. Right, he doesn't necessarily ascribe any political values to the forced rebel, right? But he does seem to mention this allegiance to almost like natural rights that the forced rebel is removing himself to preserve. He mentions the person that shoots the auxiliary police officers when they violate the sanctity of his home. So I think there is some type of, maybe spiritual is the wrong way, but abstract notions of absolute rights that the forced rebel must remove himself from society to protect from being violated.
So it's kind of like what are those guys that, they retreat into the Idaho forest and say, we're like defending our right to.
Yeah, right. So I think that's like the dark side of the forest rebels. Like when we meet actual people like this, a lot of times, they're living in a bunker or something, right? They're wearing tinfoil hats. Right. It's a problematic thing to me. It's a theory that sounds great, and maybe it's not so hot in reality.
So, Beau, that's another way of asking the question that I was asking. What do we take from these guys? Are these guys nutcases that live in a bunker? Are they heroes of the civil rights movement because they stood up to, the oppressive state?
Maybe like if you are considering yourself a forced rebel, then maybe you have some issues or something. But I think there is something to be said for that the idea of stepping back and being hesitant to join causes or be part of mobilizations.
All I just want to give him a chance to speak. Go ahead. Chris.
Thank you. These were really engaging and interesting papers. But, what Joe Bendersky just said kind of really articulated for me something that was kind of bugging me, which is, and this is, by the way, more of a comment than a question, but that there's this kind of literary valorization of war going on here, and it does kind of neglect what we know about the soldier's experience. And so it strikes me as there's almost a, if we enter ethics, right, there's a kind of almost disastrous normative thesis here lurking, which is, to put it bluntly, war is good, right? It provides meaning and value. And of course, I think we'd all agree we don't really want to go in that direction, right? So just echoing what I take.
Russell's next, and then I'll get back to Joe.
I mean, to the last comment, I don't think anybody said that war is good, and I know explicitly that I said that that was not the case. But it doesn't mean that every experience of everyone in war is absolutely bad, that there is a possibility of significant and positive and redemptive experience in war, even though we don't wish that war happened. Right? Wars do happen. How do we live in them? That's the real question. And the fact that we're paying attention to the intellectualized version of war, I mean, yours was a question of a historian. I appreciate that, but this is Telos, and we do theory and philosophy, and even just phrasing it as forms of war pushes it in a Platonic direction. But I want to comment on the conversation between Marcia and Beau and David just now about who is the forest rebel and who is the partisan. I mean, strictly speaking, the partisan. For Schmidt and Jünger, I mean, these are the anti-Nazi fighters in the Balkans, and it's the FLN in Algeria. So these are irregular soldiers, right? And what's their status, right? When they engage in war, are they criminals, right? Or are they patriots? With regard to the forest rebel, that's different. This is what Jünger otherwise calls the anarch, the absolute individualist, the libertarian, if you will. Is he in a bunker with a tinfoil hat, or is this Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond? Exactly. I mean, this is the rejection of civilization and a search for a kind of individualist opposition. And I guess so that I wouldn't. When Franz Mohr says at that point that Germany has to become a republic, at that point, as far as I'm concerned, he has ceased to be a Jungerian forest rebel because he's taken up a quasi-partisan position.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Fair criticism. And I'll pronounce it incorrectly, Oemesville, right? He builds a bunker. He actually is a person in a bunker. He doesn't end up using it, but he is part of society, but also a part. And he makes that very clear, right? He tends bar for the condor, right? He's kind of a lackey to power, right? But he has an intellectual life completely apart from all that, and that's where his real freedom lies. Mm-hmm. Is that he's part of the state, right? And he benefits from his position in the state or the city state, whatever it is. And then I found the end of it kind of ambiguous, right? Does he die in the forest? Does he disappears into the forest?
He disappears in the forest.
Disappears into the forest, but he also goes with the condor on a hunting trip out there, again accompanying the state or the state power.
Yeah, accompanying state power, but in no way believing or endorsing or embracing ideologically state power.
Yes, and I think, Marcia, I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah, so the real dangerous people are the ones who are registered independent.
Okay, Joe and...
That was an interesting paper.
Okay, this is not a question, this is commentary without apology. As a historian who interjects historical reality into this discussion, and Mario and I talked about what I'm about to say before. And when you deal with Jünger, you have to deal with Jünger in phases. He's not the same, right, in the Forest Passage as he was in Storm of Steel.
You mean it depends what drugs he's taking? Sorry.
Yes, he moved from beer to whatever. Okay, all right. I think in the Storm of Steel, he was still drinking beer. All right, maybe some schnapps, I don't know. But in any event, to deal with David's question, he's not a nihilist at that stage, right? He is very much a German nationalist. Throughout the whole Weimar Republic, he is engaged in the nationalistic struggle against the Republic. And with regard to specific war, I think in I'm pretty sure actually, in Storm of Steel, either the introduction to that or in the text, he talks about nothing being nobler than die at the head of 100 men, and then talks about it is what? There's nothing, my generation, right, knew how to fight and die for an ideal. That's, all right, so.
Okay. You want to respond? Okay. All right. Back to you, Russell.
But what Jünger then goes on to do is really to elevate the experience of the soldier in a post-national manner. He's as respectful for the French veteran as he is for the German veteran. So he ceases to become to act as a German, as an anti-French, anti-American, anti-English nationalist. To David's point about all he does is elevate his subjectivity, no, I don't. I think he's a critic of subjectivity. Period. What he does elevate is it's almost Heideggerian, the primacy of being, which the bourgeois world has forgotten, and therefore he can embrace kind of cosmic existence. The world that he rejects is the world that has forgotten being.
So, but practically, I mean, practically speaking, he's really just, he's kind of like the, Hegel's Lord, right, in a sense, or I guess the modern form of Vitae, of somebody that says, myself, my subjectivity is really what I have to affirm because I'm affirming it against this existential danger, right? And I don't see why it has. I mean, I don't see what the difference is between the Heideggerian being and this type of affirmation of subjectivity against whatever the threat of annihilation of that subjectivity.
It sounds more Telos.
So for all of the Jünger that I've read, I think I know nothing about his subjectivity. He rarely talks about his deep love. Where's his Diotima? Where's his Juliet? None of that is there. This is not about subjectivity in any sense that we use the term. It's not about subjectivity in the sense of here's a project I want to carry out. It's about a rediscovery of that which the bourgeois world denies, and that's enough. And it's Beatles and Stones. that's not rock and roll, right?
You beat my punchline.
It's entomology and geology and meteorology, and it all of that which the world forgets. And that's why he's close to nature.
Okay, on that point.
There were some other questions, maybe the others respond?
Well, we're having a great discussion here. I mean, do you want me to cut it off? I mean, did anybody else have or do you guys mind answering a couple more? Go ahead. I don't think we should be so. Marcia, you had a question? No? Is that it?
I was just pointing to the clock.
Oh, okay. All right, then. Okay, then we're done here. We're done. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank the panel and everyone who's participated. To give them a round hand. And please, I want to remind everybody, pick up your copy of Ernst Jünger. It's available at your local Chelsea drugstore where if you can't get what you want, you'll get what you need.